If you ever ask Hollywood to depict a massive army, it usually looks something like this. A gigantic, endless horde which stretches off into the horizon. And I have to hand it to them. It definitely looks epic, especially with modern CGI. Unfortunately, it's completely wrong. And not just a little wrong, but monumentally wrong, to the point that I'd argue it spawned one of the biggest misconceptions about ancient warfare out there. But they're not the only ones to blame. This phenomena is so bad that even historical media has trouble accurately depicting large armies. I'd even bet the biggest history nerds out there still fail to grasp what a massive army actually looks like. So today, we're going to clear up this misconception with the help of historians, reenactors, and simulations in Unreal Engine 5. You'll even get a sneak preview of our working model for the Battle of Cannae. This is the true size of massive armies of antiquity. So if you're like me, you probably listened to a bunch of documentaries, be it walking the dog, working out, doing chores, you name it. And often the trouble for me is I end up with super low battery life or just outright damaged or lost earbuds. But thankfully today's sponsor Raycon has you covered. Their everyday earbuds sound awesome, fit snug, are water resistant, and now have a bunch of new features, like a 32-hour battery life, a quick charge function to get 90 minutes of juice out of 10 minutes in the wall, multi-connectivity for 2 devices at once, active noise cancelling, and more. And on top of the everyday earbuds case, you can actually get the protective case, which comes in a bunch of really nice designs and variants. I think they look really aesthetic. It fits on your device really snugly and comes with wireless charging. I've had mine for quite some time now, and it's super convenient to just, at the end of the day, slip this onto the nightstand and know that when I get up bright and early in the morning, it'll be fully charged, ready to pick up and go, and I can never go back to my old ways. So get great audio quality at half the price of premium brands by picking up a pair of Raycon everyday earbuds. And act now, because it's time to save big for Black Friday with up to 30% site-wide when using the link in the description or going to buyraycon.com/Invicta. That's up to 30% off everything on Raycon's website, so definitely check it out and enjoy. So let's start off here with a bit of a highlight reel of massive armies you've likely seen in media, and let our friend Roel Kanijndijk provide some commentary.
So one of the things you see in this movie, and you see it in so many of these movies, it's really a common theme, is that when the army approaches battle, in order to try and depict just how big these armies are, these directors like to just, nowadays you can do this with CGI quite easily, just copy that line over and over again and have these men stretch all the way back into the background or off to the horizon. Just this enormous mass of men coming down to meet the enemy in battle. And this obviously looks really impressive. And when you're looking at a movie like, Lord of the Rings, for instance, you kind of want it to be like that. You want this enemy to look, absolutely inexhaustible. Or when you're looking at Troy and it's trying to depict the Greek army as in like all of the Greeks coming out to battle for this great mythical clash. I mean, sure, then you can easily forgive it because it just looks like it's meant to look, it serves a purpose in the story. But when you're looking at more historical engagements, this is just not what a battle line looked like. Sometimes battle lines would go deep in order to become sturdier, to resist breakthroughs, in order to keep the front line in the fight longer. But even the deepest formations really wouldn't go much further than 30, maybe 50 men deep. And anything beyond that is just, no one ever considered that to be functional in the slightest. It just has no purpose to put your troops in such deep formations, in such massive columns. Instead, you want to make sure that you deploy wide enough that the enemy can't get around you. And depth is actually, an enemy of that. Depth is if you want to make your formation deeper, you are sacrificing width. The deeper you want to be, the fewer men you can put side by side. And so most ancient battle formations actually went for greater width, more line at the expense of their depth. So when you're talking about an ancient battle line, you're not talking about this endless, bottomless, essentially mass of humanity that is sort of flowing down like a river into the plain. You're talking about a line that is wide and thin. So thin as in maybe 6 ranks deep, maybe 8 ranks deep. Maybe there's another line behind that if you're talking about Roman legions, but really not much more than that. And so the depiction that you get in a lot of these movies of these endless masses of people, I mean, mathematically, it's just impossible. You're talking about when you see that on a screen in a movie like Spartacus, or in a movie or in a TV show like, I don't know, The Witcher, you're talking about tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of entities that are being placed on that screen. What you actually want to be thinking of when you're thinking of the deployment of an army that is a few thousand, maybe a few tens of thousands strong, is a very wide, several kilometers wide, but only a few ranks deep. That's how you deploy for battle, because a breakthrough is dangerous, but 6 to 8 to 10 ranks, it will stop that. But what's much more dangerous than that is getting outflanked and rolled up. And so you want to make sure you cover that field from flank to flank, from something like a river or a mountain or something else covering your flank on either side, to anchor your line to make sure no one can get around you. That's much more important. And you're not going to keep stacking more and more troops behind that line for no good purpose.
So I wanted to thank Roel Klenendijk for that awesome introduction, and what we're doing now is loading an Unreal Engine 5 environment to give you a more grounded sense of what all these principles look like in practice, and we'll be weaving into our discussion actual footage from reenactors to give you an even more grounded sense of how this all comes together. So we're going to start here at the very ground floor of building an army and how an army moves by looking at the individual soldier. And the first point to make with this soldier is, well, I have a couple different, types of army soldiers that you might have seen in this era. You have a Roman hastati, you have phalangites, you have a Celt, you have a hoplite, you have a later kind of Byzantine soldier, and all of them may look different on the surface, but fundamentally the mechanics of how soldiers function are pretty similar. In this era, you're going to be, sword and board type troops, close quarters weapons. They all, yes, may have slight differences in how they perform, but fundamentally, you have to close the distance, you have to fight with your foe. And on top of that, the ergonomics of how humans just work in terms of the space we need, the way we interact with one another, our psychology when it comes to feeling fear in battle or feeling energy when we're around our comrades. There's a lot more in common with these variety of troops than otherwise you would think. So fundamentally, you can boil down a lot of behavior in this period of the individual soldier to be very much the same. So with that being said, let's now move on to the next unit, which is going to be the file. So the file is going to be maybe known by different names in different eras, but it's essentially going to be the smallest group of soldiers that you'll typically find together. So a file is going to be something that might be on the order of, a half dozen, so like 5 or 6 or so men, like you're seeing in this first line of men, or it could be all the way up into, 12 to 16 troops. So the reason for this is multifold. First is going to be matter of logistics. When it comes to actually moving soldiers around, oftentimes a file is going to be the small group of soldiers that might share a tent on the march, or it might be the group of soldiers that share, common rations or a cooking pot or things like that. So just on a small scale, it's the small number of troops that are going to be sharing goods and working together, living together on a campaign. The other logistical reasons why it's this small is, well, it seems that in terms of kind of humans and how we socialize and interact with each other, this is kind of the sweet spot for commanding small groups of soldiers. To the point that if you look at modern armies, squads of soldiers are typically at about a dozen or so men. So this is something that is just true throughout human history. And the idea of a file being kind of this small group of command is really important for antiquity because in this era, you're not dealing with professionals. Most soldiers of this age are going to be just, common citizens that are levied to serve and take up arms. And they may have some training that they do on and off throughout the year. They may train as groups, but for the most part, they're not really skilled at executing sophisticated maneuvers and all that stuff. And so what's really easy for them is follow the leader. And that's essentially what the point of a file is. You identify your file, someone is going to be tapped on the shoulder and told, hey, you're the file leader or you're the half file leader. Sometimes the guy in the back is going to be known as the file closer, and it's just these simple roles. And once you want to move that force, the file leader just starts to march and everyone else follows behind them. So that is going to be the simple mechanics of why files are kind of your base moving appendage, moving block of an army. And to drive that point home, I wanted to show you some footage that we have from Paul Pardunius and his group of hoplite reenactors who actually went to Plataea, and they shared some awesome footage of them moving around in a file. You can see how organic it is, and you can see how it makes it easy to traverse terrain. And what I wanted to show you here is a little clip that he has of teaching small school students of how you can actually just follow the leader and march around in a line and form a battle line. So it just goes to show how important this file and the role of a file leader and file closer is to just doing these basic functions of an army. So that's going to be one of our smallest building blocks. Then when it becomes time to actually move around, you'll have several files that might be paired together. So what we're showing here is going to be maybe, a column of men where there's 4 files. And you can see here, 4 files is probably something that's convenient to fit most roads of antiquity, which are going to be geared around, maybe two-way traffic or a wagon, very, very shallow or narrow roads, I should say. So a couple files side to side can march collectively together, very easy. And then what you might have is a cluster of files will probably have some sort of officer, and they might stand to the side or to the front, and it's going to be their role to ensure that the files under their command are, keeping up the pace or staying in formation or doing whatever. So this is where you have your disciplinarian. But again, from the perspective of your common soldier, it's really simple. Follow the leader, follow your column, and take heed of your officer or your disciplinarian. But overall, not really anyone in this formation has to be, a super veteran or anything like that. So that's essentially how you're going to evolve your formations. And this is essentially what it looks like for an army to move over time. We simulated, for instance, an entire Roman army as it moves. And these are columns that are, many, many, many kilometers long moving across the environment. So most of the time when you see an army on the move, it's not going to be this giant locust swarm. Instead, think of it more like a snake. But now eventually our snake is going to reach its objective and it's going to want to deploy for battle. Now there's multiple ways for these columns to evolve into lines. In this case, we're showing a simple one that was often used by the Spartans, and it goes as follows. Basically, you have your cluster, so this might be like the Enomotia for the Spartans, which is just a couple files put together. And essentially what they do is they're going to come from column, and you can see them there arraying themselves into a line. So what this looks like from the ground level perspective is if I'm one of these troops, all I have to do is if I'm in the back, I follow the units of my file. And if I'm in the front and I'm my file leader, all I have to do is actually keep an eye on the unit in front of me, march roughly behind them, so it's still follow the leader, but then what I want to do is actually I want to keep an eye on the corner of this formation. And what that does is as everyone does that, what it does is it links the units together to the point that when I'm here and I'm getting closer to the battle line, I'm going to fall into lockstep right next to this force, and they are essentially going to stop. So there'll be probably a couple officers at the front of the line who are making sure that, the file leaders end up at the same line, but everyone who's falling behind them is essentially going to follow the corner of the unit behind them and slot themselves in to now take up the line. So that's one of the Spartan ways that you can evolve from column into line formation. There's a bunch of other ways to do this. Some armies might just walk to the end of a battlefield in column, then they might turn, and then the leading unit will then just march to the very end of the battle line, and then it'll turn itself to face forward. You also have other ways that you can evolve files. So for instance, if a file is, let's say, 16 men, and you want to deploy 16 men deep, that's fine. 16 men are going to walk into position. But if you want to have 16 men split out into something that's, 6 men deep, well, then that formation can split itself in half, and it can do it again. And you can do this just by leaving little gaps and having your half file leaders simply shift over and fill in the gap. So all sorts of ways to use the basic file to create your formation. So now that we've covered the basics of having your troops get into files, having those files march out on campaign, having them arrive at the site of battle, and then deploy into ranks, I think it is worthy at this point that we talk about some of the differences between depth and width and the formations that historical armies adopted. So we're getting now into the upper echelons of, well, how does the army deploy in battle, which is the very premise of this video. So a couple of things to note from ancient Greek sources when it comes to hoplites of antiquity. Usually you see something, as Rule was mentioning, on the order of maybe a block of 5 to 6 men deep is pretty typical, but sources mention that going up even higher to 12, 16 or so. And so what you're doing when you're trading between a shorter versus a deeper formation is obviously you're getting more depth, but any men that you deploy to the rear means that your ultimate formation is going to be narrower. So you're trading depth, which is typically associated with staying power, for width, which might give you more flexibility and prevent you from being outflanked. Because you'd imagine, let's consider the mechanics here. We have a deep formation. I'm going to stand in the back. So obviously the advantage of having a deep formation here is I feel very secure in this back row. I can hardly see the front lines compared to if I'm in a short row. Yeah, I could probably start to see what's going on. Maybe my adrenaline is pumping a bit harder. Maybe I get secondhand exhaustion. So there is a noticeable difference in the depth of the formations, just psychologically from where you're standing. In terms of how these formations do ultimately kind of fall apart, it's thought that basically the frontline fighting is obviously taking place here. Maybe some of these soldiers may get exhausted, may get run down, may get felled in combat, but usually attrition is quite low. So really the risk of your formations falling apart is the people in the front sensing that things aren't going well, and then maybe they try to back up, they push against their neighbors, they try and yell, they try and do something. There is some sort of loss of cohesion and morale at the front, which ultimately causes maybe the propagation of panic to go to the rear. And ultimately it's thought that it's probably the people in the rear who feel that panic who are then going to say, oh, we're losing in the front, I better tuck tail and run. And as they run away, that basically opens up the floodgates for the rest of the ranks. So that is kind of the mechanics of psychology for the depth of your formations. Now, obviously that sort of thing happening is going to be much easier to happen if you have a shallow formation. These guys here are going to feel much more in danger, much more liable to run, versus a deep formation is going to feel much safer. So that is the advantage. That's the psychology behind why depth is better. But of course, if you're having two armies face off against one another, there is diminishing returns. Presumably in the very far back here, it doesn't make too much more sense to stack much deeper than this, because alternatively, I could just deploy them to the flank, and if I'm fighting a foe, I can now just merely go around the side and get at their rear. So that is the trade-off. So oftentimes commanders are going to be trading off between the two, but somewhere in antiquity, it's going to be about 6, maybe to 12, 20 men deep. Now there are some extreme cases that are worth mentioning. So what I've shown over here is a 50-man deep formation that the Thebans formed at the Battle of Leuctra. So this one is quite insane. You can see the jump. So again, thinking in terms of psychology, just how safe I felt here. Now imagine that I'm going to be at the very back of my 50-man deep formation. This is a world unto its own in terms of safety. I can hardly even tell I'm on the battlefield at this point. Probably can't even hear the clashing of arms over the heavy cheering that's going on for the guys in the back. So 50 men deep is really, really pushing it. And the reason this was deployed at Leuctra was, well, the Thebans were facing against the Spartans, and they weren't necessarily sure that their men would have the morale to deal with the Spartans. And so this is ultimately the engagement that you get at Leuctra. A Spartan force that on the left you can see here is about 15 men deep versus the 50-man deep one. And really it wasn't a question of who could out-punch the other in the face in the front ranks, but really who had the morale to stay and just hold their ground. And 50 men deep won out. Now, there is some contention about, well, is it further than that? Is there some benefit for having ranks that are deeper in terms of what is thought of as the othismos, the pushing? And this is something that is somewhat debated by academics, where we're not actually sure how to take this idea of pushing literally. Were the front ranks coming in and bashing each other? Was there an importance of having more depth because it allowed you to exert more pressure on the front? So this is something that's still very much debated by academics. The most kind of fresh wave of thinkers don't think it was really pushing and think that it was more like a symbolic concept of battle, and that really it was much more fluid, a lot of fencing, a lot of distances being drawn out kind of, psychologically here. I'm facing off against the enemy. I might dart forward, fear spent, come back into my line, throw some javelins, recruit. So a lot more of this kind of back and forth pulsing is another model. But supposing that there was an advantage to depth and there was really pushing, this is actually something intriguing that was tested by Paul Bardunius again in his group of hoplite reenactors. They took a pressure gauge and they essentially stacked men one behind the other and had them push on themselves. And there is a notable force that can be imparted on the front ranks. But what you see from this testing is that at a certain distance, the effective force that gets transferred from every added rank diminishes quite quickly. So even if we do assume that there is an othismos and a literal pressure match happening, you really lose that advantage the further back you go. So anything beyond maybe 10, 12 men, you really lose out on the pressure match. So that really reinforces the idea that, if ancient armies were deploying up to 50 men deep, it's not about the pressure, it's really about the psychology and the morale. But that really kind of puts an upper limit on sort of the depth of individual units. Now, as a final comment, what we can do is go to the end of our battle line here, and what we've done is we've actually arranged a couple different units that you might see from the various cultures that we started this video off with. So let's go ahead and get over there. So here are a variety of different armies, as we saw in the beginning: Celts, Macedonians, you have Romans, etc., all in their various formations. But again, what you'll be seeing here is that regardless of the formation and the equipment, generally the depths are not that much more than what we've seen before. But let's go ahead and start with the first one, which is going to be a Celtic formation. Unfortunately, these are not super well documented, but generally you squint and you call this thing a warband that's forming up into a shield wall, and typically the mechanics are going to be the same as a Greek phalanx, where you have the front ranks are going to be the ones engaged in combat. In the case of tribal warfare, this is typically going to be, your chieftain, his retinue, the elites that are up front that are trying to gain glory, trying to gain renown, and so they're going to be doing the fighting. Meanwhile, the rear ranks further back who are encouraging them, supporting them, they're probably going to be less well armed, less well equipped, more of your basic kind of peasant guy who has some equipment. So really, this is going to be a soft rear supporting force versus the real fighting capacities in the front. And again, same mechanics are in play here. The front does the fighting, and then you get diminishing returns for the rear, but overall the rear is there to support, to make sure that you feel like you can sustain the fight, to help with morale. And there's the added factor that in some of this tribal warfare, just having more numbers actually plays out in another aspect of psychology, which is the war cry. Often war bands would deploy opposite from one another, shout, yell, bang their shields, and it's kind of like animals in the wild, where instead of fighting, which could lead to the doom of either animal, they're often going to do these kind of signs to show which one is more well off, more well endowed, more ferocious. So often war bands will face off, and sometimes it's said that by just who can yell the loudest or be the most imposing, that might decide the battle, and the other side just tucks tail and run. So that is another addition of maybe why you might want more depth, is maybe it has some impact on the psychological, presentation before battle even begins. So that's everything about the Celts. So again, same thing, war band, maybe 20, 30 men deep, but still same mechanics that would encourage them to go wide. Next, we get into the phalangites of the Macedonians that you can see here, and same mechanics. You probably see them formed in these pike blocks that are maybe like 15, 20 men deep, and the same thing wide as a basic unit. But one interesting thing here is that the pikes actually allow you to do something more. So in the same way that added troops for depth might give you better morale, a pike kind of is a pseudo stand-in for depth. You lower the pike, it keeps the enemy at bay, it means that more of your front ranks can actually participate in the fight, and what it effectively means is that for the same amount of troops, let's say you have 10 men deep in a warband versus 10 men deep in a pike formation, the pike formation has an effective deeper depth because of the added amount of reach that your equipment like your spear and your sarissa will give you. So in this case, the pike is a novel invention for keeping your enemy at bay and allowing you to have more effective staying power, effective depth for the same amount of men power. That means that you can probably shed ranks from the rear, make slightly shallower formations, and put those over on the flank. Another innovation in terms of this play between width and depth is going to be the Romans. So the Romans in their basic unit formations were probably something like this. A century that has about 60 men, probably 6 men deep, 10 men wide. So you end up with a little block like this. But what the Romans do that is nifty is they kind of slice up their population by age and wealth. They then give them different roles. So the youngest are going to be skirmishers. And then after that you have the hastati, then you have the principes and the triarii. And what the Romans have done here is they've actually decided to separate out their units. So while yes, the same basic unit engaged in the battle line, so in this case the hastati, may just be 6 men deep, by separating out the units and having this layering, this multiple line of strategic reserves, it gives you a better effective depth. And so the Romans may be some of the guys who have perhaps the best advantages on the battlefield because of their depth. So they're trading some width for depth, and obviously this was a key to the Romans, not just because of that staying power, but they decided to have a separation between their various ranks. which means that not only do they have, more staying power, but actually these units that are detached to the rear can actually start to do more important things. They can flank, they can plug holes, they can push forward with assaults. The Triarii can fall back and, guard the camp, create a line of retreat. So ultimately, that is kind of how the Romans come into play when it comes to depth. But even if we assume that we're talking about the Romans here, which is probably the deepest of our formations, it's actually not going to be that deep, maybe 100 meters, maybe 200 meters if you really stretch it. But that is a far cry from what we were seeing in those earlier clips of Hollywood films. Now, as a final send-off, I did want to give you a preview of the Battle of Cannae that we've rendered here, and in this incarnation, the legions, according to history, have been not only supersized from about 4,500 to 5,000 troops, but in addition, each of the sentries in the maniples are stacked super deep, so this is probably the deepest you'll ever see a Roman legion. And even at Cannae here, you'll see in our flyover as you go throughout, because of the sheer scale of the army, yes, each legion is deep, but there's so many legions, so many cavalry, that in the scale of a battlefield, it's still almost something that looks, pancake thin. So again, this is probably what you're seeing from even the most massive armies, is a very thin, long line relative to its depth. So with that being said, I hope you really enjoyed this insight into history. I think it was a big game changer for me to understand that this is actually how armies deployed in battle, and it really made me rethink every time I saw something on Hollywood on screen. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this deep dive, and I hope you enjoyed this application of Unreal Engine to give you this grounded feel. If you like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, support us on Patreon, YouTube memberships. It all does a lot to make sure we can keep doing this, and let us know what sort of content you'd like to see covered next. See you guys in the next video.